Delighted to have you with us. Welcome to our session on supplier master data management as the foundation for digital transformation success. My name is Anthony Payne. I'm in the marketing team here at Hicks. I'm delighted today to be joined by our two presenters. We have Kurt Albertson, who is Principal and North American Practice Lead at the Hackett Group. And in a moment, I'll be handing over to Kurt to kick us off. And we're also joined by Kostas Xyliani, who is the CEO and co-founder of Hicks, and he'll be the second presenter taking us through some content today. Before we start, I'm sure most, if not all of you, have been to webinars before, so you'll know this, but just as a reminder, throughout the session, if you have any questions to either of the presenters or to both, please do feel free to drop those into the chat. You'll see the chat panel on the side of your Demio interface. Pop those in there, and then when we get to the end of the prepared content, we'll have plenty of time for Q&A. And I'll moderate those. And we'll try and get through as many questions as we get before the end of the session. But if we run out of time, then we'll be sure to follow up directly via email with whoever asked the questions. Also, as is normal, the session is being recorded, and so you'll be able to rewatch at your heart's content. We'll share the link to the recording with everybody that registered and everybody that attended the webinar as well today. So with that, thank you again for joining, and I'm going to hand over to Kurt, who's going to kick off the session and provide us some insight from himself and the Hackett Group. And then when Kurt's done, he's going to hand over to Kostas, and we'll switch to Q&A. So thanks, Kurt. Over to you.
Great. Thanks, Anthony. Can you hear me okay? Okay, fantastic. All right, so let's jump into it. From an agenda perspective, I'm going to spend about 20-25 minutes just talking about some of the insights from Hackett, from a lot of the studies we do around master data management, data quality. Boy, this issue has been around as long as I've been in the procurement space, which has been about 30 years now. So certainly an interesting topic, and look forward to the conversation. So I'll kick it off and then turn it over to Kostas. For those of you that may or may not be familiar with the Hackett Group, I'll just give you a quick background just so you know kind of where the information is coming from. We are an empirically based kind of advisory firm. We do a lot of studies, right? So I'm going to share with you a lot of data from the studies we do from the market on this topic of master data, getting into data quality. As Anthony said, I'm principal of our procurement advisory practice here in North America. I run our North American procurement advisory practice, where we advise our clients on best practices on this topic, as well as many others. Again, I've been in the space for about 30 years across that kind of source to settle space. So look forward to today's conversation. All right. Let me start at a 10,000 foot level here, right? This slide is really just showing the trend of priorities, right? And I think this is probably not very, probably not very insightful. You probably could have guessed this, right? That when we look at the last 4 or 5 years, or 6 years actually, and we look at kind of the priorities of, in this case, kind of those purchase to pay process leaders, this idea of digital transformation has been number 1 or number 2, right? Going back to 2018, skipped a couple of years there, but it was kind of the same. We have seen digital transformation at the top of a priority list for P2P leaders, source to pay leaders, really across the G&A functions, right? It's been such a critical topic. It's kind of gone back and forth between digital transformation and increasing stakeholder satisfaction, but it has been either 1 or 2. The interesting thing about this, however, and at Hackett, we have a lot of conversations with our clients, is when we ask companies about the success of their digital transformation journeys, it isn't uncommon, and I would say probably anywhere, depending on the functionality we're talking about, anywhere from 25 to 50% of the time, our clients are telling us they don't really achieve the value they expected from these digital transformation programs that they're implementing. So we kind of wanted to look into that and really understand, in a study we did this year, what is causing that, right? What are some of the capabilities that they need to have to be successful in their digital transformation journeys, and what are some of the barriers they're running into. So when we think about this idea of digital transformation, this slide is really just looking at some of those implementation capabilities that they really said are critical to the success of these programs. And I don't think, number one and number two, we hear quite a bit. I don't think that those are earth shattering, right? Change management, right? We always hear that, companies don't wrap the change management around these programs that they need. They don't fund it, they don't resource it appropriately. But it's really number three that I want to kind of focus in on today, and we're going to have a discussion about. It's really this data and systems integration capability, right? It's the master data at the heart of a lot of these technology implementations. And it's getting that data correct, right? It's data quality, it's getting, clean data, it's getting kind of a system of record, it's getting a common, single truth of record, right? And then integrating that throughout the process, right? As opposed to having all this disparate data in, across the end-to-end process, not really understanding what data is accurate, which one is the master record, right? I was on site with a client just yesterday, actually. We were talking through kind of where they were from a maturity perspective. And this idea of disparate master data kind of was front and center in that conversation and a big issue for them. So in terms of implementation capabilities, if you're going to go out and do some type of digital transformation effort, which is on top of the list for almost all companies these days, really getting data and systems integration right is a key component of that. The second question we asked in the study was, okay, well, you have to have these capabilities to be successful, but what are the barriers you're running into, right? If you were to kind of prioritize what went wrong and why didn't you achieve the business outcomes that you were expecting, or to the degree that you were expecting, what are the barriers that kind of kept you from that? And of course, number one is this idea, again, of organizational change management that we've got to focus on. And, too often people pay lip service to, and they don't really invest in it. But right behind that was this idea of data quality, and the data migration across the systems was the number two barrier that we're running into, right? And we continue to hear that over and over again. So poor data quality, not migrating kind of the core data across all the systems, is that one of the two major barriers, again, just behind organizational change management, that we tend to hear from our clients, right? And I think everybody knows this. It's not probably, you probably could have guessed it, that it was going to be, one or two from a barrier perspective. It's something we always hear about. But we're not getting it right, when we do these digital transformations. More often than not, we aren't getting it right with these programs that we're implementing. At the heart of this, really, it's about, still having a lot of manual processes deployed across, the systems we're trying to implement when it comes to master data, right? So this slide really looks at, the reasons for data corrections. Why is the master data quality not there? And certainly occasionally it is some kind of problem between the transfer of data between systems, but that's generally not the case. At the heart of it, it really is having still manual processes in place to collect the data and then to input the data into the systems. We see more often than not, almost 60% of the time, it's inaccurate data submitted to the MDM team, the master data management team, for entry, right? So the individuals that are providing the data are doing it in a manual fashion. They're filling out a form, they're putting in an email. They may or may not understand the criticality of the data that they're providing, so they just give us something. But again, it comes from kind of a place of manual effort where we're collecting data either from internal stakeholders or suppliers, and it's inaccurate from the beginning or in the wrong type of format. That generally tends to be right off the bat, the data we're collecting is inaccurate. And then the next, about 30% of the time, we're just not entering the data correctly into the system. It's still a manual process. We've got multiple people entering data into the system. Again, they may or may not understand the criticality of getting that data right. So when we look at it, 85, 86% of the time, it really is due to some still manual process that we have in terms of collecting or inputting the data into our systems of record. And it has a big impact, right? If we kind of bounce back out to a 10,000 foot level and we look at this area of supply data management, and we look at this as kind of, it really is kind of the foundation that feeds a lot of the other areas of this kind of, in this case, kind of that source to pay process, right? We see it has a strong leakage to understanding, discovering new suppliers based on kind of what suppliers may purchase. What about, spend analysis and supplier performance, executing and evaluating on the sourcing process, certainly onboarding suppliers, setting suppliers up in the vendor master file is a very supply data rich process. Suppliers' ability to kind of provide self-service and access information, stakeholders' ability to access information into our systems. And then at a much higher level, we see from a planning perspective, right? I mean, we are becoming, if we think about the idea of that source to settle process and the procurement organization that manages this or the finance organization that might be managing part of this, we really are becoming a much more data intensive type of organization. We need information to make good decisions across these processes. And poor data quality really impacts our ability to do that. The other big impact is on the ever important areas of compliance and risk management, right? If we've got poor data quality, if we don't have access to the right data, if we don't have readily available access to the right data, it poses an issue from a compliance and then ongoing risk management perspective. And that idea of management is an ever increasing priority for most organizations today. And frankly, again, if you don't have the basic information on what's happening in your supply base, what's happening in your processes to support those suppliers, you're not going to be able to make those good decisions. So, we often hear, the solution providers, particularly kind of the suite solution providers that implement, kind of these end-to-end solutions. When they talk about their value proposition, one of the things they really lean into is this idea of the fact that, if you implement an end-to-end solution, you're going to get improved data quality. And we got to be a little bit careful there in terms of buying into some of these kind of broader suite solution providers when they talk about that, because that's just not naturally the case, right? That is not an outcome that just naturally occurs through the implementation of some of these technologies. We have to implement a series of best practices around managing this data. And you see this in this rather complicated slide, but I really want to zero in on this idea of greater data quality as being an expected benefit of kind of a lot of times when we implement these suite source to pay solutions. And then what you see on the right-hand side, and this is kind of the what I had referenced earlier in the discussion, what you see on the right-hand side is half the time, what the market is telling us is we didn't get greater data quality. That was not an outcome, even though it was promised to us. It was an expectation we had when we went through this whole suite solution implementation. And there's a lot of reasons for that. But again, what I want to caution is it's not just a natural outcome of implementing kind of an end-to-end solution. So be careful about that. It is when we think about the expected benefits, more often than not, it is the biggest area of uncertainty, or when we think about kind of post-implementation where we didn't get the benefit we expected, is this improved data quality. You have to work for it. So, I talked about some of these best practices Costas is really going to probably spend more time than me, so I'll kind of won't steal his thunder. But I will just kind of hint at a couple of things that we tend to see from a supply master data management best practice adoption perspective that we can focus in on. This slide comes from an actual master data management study we do in the market periodically, and it looks at kind of those top performers in this area. And one of the things that should jump out at you pretty quickly, and again, I won't get into how we define a top performer, but there's an empirical way of the companies that we do include in the benchmark. We quantify through an algorithm who are the top performers, and it tends to be about 10 to 15% of the companies that participated. And on this slide, it's obvious what jumps out at you, right? When we think about, you can't have 1 million people inputting data into the systems, right? So what we tend to see as a best practice is we do tend to see a greater consolidation of the actual master data management team in those top performers, whether they have one global team or regional teams. They tend to be much more kind of look at the master data management process and updates, inputs as a shared service, global business services type of process, as opposed to having it very, very decentralized. Certainly, this is a very decentralized process in terms of a lot of people having a hand in managing it. But in terms of the centralization of the inputs and the maintenance of master data management, top performers do tend to centralize that activity quite a bit more than their non-top performer peers. The other aspect of it is they do tend to kind of think about specific technology related to things like supplier onboarding. The supplier onboarding process is obviously a key process in terms of collecting and inputting data, master data related to our suppliers. And instead of just leaving it up to manual processes, or a lot of times even these suite solutions that are out there, they really will zero in on supplier onboarding as a critical process that needs to be supported with a supplier onboarding solution, right? And when we think about those that have done that, the benefits that they've achieved, first of all, they have kind of simplified the process, right? They're able to consolidate the onboarding process, but they're also able to improve the data availability and data quality through the use of specific supplier onboarding solutions. So a very important aspect of that. We talk about kind of at Hackett, we have this idea, if you're not measuring it, then you're not able to kind of improve a process. So let's have a quick conversation here about kind of this idea of supplier onboarding and the collection of all this data, doing the risk assessments, which is certainly a very data intensive process when we're working with new suppliers. How are we measuring that process of bringing on new suppliers? Well, it tends to be most organizations use the idea of cycle time if they're measuring it all. Still less than 60% in the last study we did that focused on this from a supplier onboarding. A lot of companies aren't even measuring that. But certainly one of the things, and we see less than half of companies actually measuring it, is the quality of the data being collected during this supplier onboarding process. Only 45%. We're really zeroing in. And as an ongoing performance metric, measuring the quality of the data being collected and inputted and maintained of our supply base. And we simply need to do a better job than that, brother. If you're not measuring quality of your master data content, you're really not taking that foundational first step in terms of what we need to do to improve it. So kind of zeroing in on that cycle time metric, just to share a little bit of data with you. When we think about this, comes from a recent study we did on the supplier onboarding process. We do see this varies quite a bit, right? And this is all companies, whether they're using a specific supplier onboarding solution or not. So this includes companies that are still doing it very manually through the, maybe email and phone calls. And on the left, you see kind of low risk suppliers versus high risk suppliers. Certainly the complexity of the risk assessments is going to drive cycle times. And we're just simply looking at the distribution, the profile of the cycle times that were reported. And obviously risk has a big impact on these cycle times, right? If we kind of zero in on median and the bottom quartiles, so those that are taking the longest, you see more high risk type suppliers are going to take about 50% more time, whether we're talking, whether we go from 17 days to 26 days, or for the bottom quartile going from 33 days to almost 50 days, right? So risk is a big contributor to the cycle time, as most of us would have expected. But I know people like the data. So, think about how maybe your onboarding times compare, right? And this obviously, kind of going back to the slide I just showed, does have an impact on the satisfaction of our internal stakeholders, right? If we're taking 50, 60 days, almost 2 months to get a supplier onboarded before a internal stakeholder can use them, that's frustrating, right, for our internal stakeholders. But obviously we have to do the due diligence in the onboarding process to collect the quality data and then also do the risk assessments that need to be done. But how can we do that more effectively from a data quality perspective and an assessment perspective? And how can we do it to achieve the objectives of our stakeholders, which is in a adequate cycle time and not dragging it out for months? Those are some of the things that we'll talk about. So I'll leave you with just some important steps to successful master data management before I turn it over to Kostas. First of all, think about the business case for master data management, right? A lot of times we don't look at this as a business case. We just think about the data and the quality, and we just say it needs to be better. But think about the outcomes that are being driven through this data. How are people consuming the data? What decisions are being made from the supply master data that we're collecting? And think about how those are impacted by poor data quality or missing data as part of your business case. Also, define the program scope, right? One of the biggest issues we get into when we talk about master data with our clients is, this discussion can go on and on, right? If you don't put boxes around it, if you don't prioritize which master data, which supply master data is most critical and we are going to focus on. So you really have to define the program clearly. Look, as I touched on, and Kostas will talk more about, the complexity of this process is it cuts across a lot of functions within the company. There's linkages outside our company with suppliers and third parties who are providing data. So this really is a complex process, and we need kind of a governance, end-to-end process ownership view to manage this, right? Procurement or AP can't solve this on their own. It needs to be managed at an enterprise level. We need formal policies and procedures in place to kind of, once we get the data accurate, we need policies, procedures in place to make sure we continue to keep that data accurate on an ongoing basis. And then again, what I mentioned before, right? If we're not measuring things like data accuracy around our supply master information, we're not going to be able to improve it. We need to measure it and able to drive formal improvement. Okay, so at this point, Kostas, I will turn it over to you.
Kurt, thank you very much. And it's great to see that empirical data backs up a lot of what we're seeing from a practitioner perspective. So we're going to go maybe a level deeper, look at some of the findings we've found from experience trying to implement this. What are the challenges? Why haven't companies, or how they've tried and maybe not yet succeeded, and how you go about if you want to be successful in such a project. So, why has something so important not yet been solved? The reality is it is super complex, and it's maybe a complex slide to illustrate the complexity. But when you think of managing suppliers, onboarding them, how the data changes, what you're seeing is there's tons of permutations and combinations. And that is because the supplier is owned by many different functions, different to other types of master data, like maybe customer, which isn't necessarily as cross-functional. A supplier is touched by everyone, by procurement, central functions, local functions, risk, compliance, quality, finance, non-finance. Everybody in one shape or form is touching a supplier. We then, whether by intent or by mistake, live in a best of breed world because, you know what, depending on what we buy, we actually want different tools. We might use Coupa or Amazon Business for catalog. We might use Fieldglass for services. We might do direct procurement in the ERP. We might have specific travel tools, right? And the list goes on and on, vertical network. So when you look at this, it's very clear that why it hasn't been solved. It is a challenging thing to try and get your hands around. And when you try and distill it, what is the true problems? Well, firstly, you have a massively diverse stakeholder group, and we know that in itself makes a challenge to drive change in a large organization, right? You have shared services, local organizations, many systems housed in supplier data, and we see systems as stakeholders themselves. We're going to come back to it. You have the supplier, right? We're trying to do more directly with our suppliers. They are a stakeholder as well, which completely changes the game because we go outside of our four walls. Then you look at the tech integration challenge, which also Kurt has highlighted. Most customers see it as a difficult thing to integrate, right? When you talk to customers, or one of the reasons they might go a single solution is they want to avoid the integration, right? They tend to perceive them as costly to operate, fragile to change, tough to maintain, and so forth. Data quality, because of how vast, and I go beyond just master data, because when we onboard, we're looking at risk and compliance, the mandate is kind of growing. It's very hard to drive consistency, accuracy, and you tend to have incomplete data. And lastly, it's the sheer variation and volumes, right? If you think of a large organization, the ones which we're serving, the data changes quickly, right? It's high volume. They have 10, 20, 50, 100, 200,000 suppliers. Multiple entry points means it just makes all of these things really hard to control, you know, many different ways of how we can create supplier data. So these are, if you think of the challenges, these are the main areas why people haven't been successful. Now, we found this quote, which for us summarizes the challenge, and we're going to dig into it a little bit deeper, but I'm going to read it out. We need to remember that only two moments matter in a piece of data's lifetime: the moment it's created and the moment it is used. And today, these two things are very disconnected, and that's kind of at the heart of it. And to give you an example of what happens today is a category manager might look at a spend report and see wrong supplier data. So of course, we're assessing the quality in a spend report saying, ooh, this data is wrong. But reality is that data quality was established a long time ago when we created and onboarded that vendor. It's a little bit like the used car salesman. You make your money when you buy the car. Data quality is created when we enter the record, but there's just this massive disconnect. And this is why so far it hasn't been solved. You know, if you were to look around and ask yourselves who in your organization owns this data problem, right? Across all these systems, across all these variations, what we're seeing is nobody owns it end to end. Maybe we own our little piece to transact or to do a quality assessment or to submit an invoice or whatever that might be. So we have a lot of people maybe assessing the quality and complaining about it, but no one tends to want to own it and drive the establishment of that quality and the governance around it. So when you look into the root causes of what causes bad data, the short version is a lack of governance, okay? And that stems across a couple different pillars. But if you think about the people side of it, first of all, it goes back to the quote we just mentioned. The people who care about the data and want to use the data tend to be more senior and don't want to do administrative work, or they're just not included in the process in the right way. So this means there's no ownership, or the person who's dealing with the data doesn't really care that much because they're not going to be the one using the data, right? And we still see data management as an administrative, clerical, non-value add work. You know, we have to shift our minds that a little bit of work distributed across a big team will create a lot of value. Because there's no owner, then of course we have no processes when we go in there, or the wrong processes, right? Either they're looking at it too simplistically, where a lot of companies just focus on onboarding and then not the other things, as we're going to see, or the challenge that we don't have end-to-end processes, right? We might have a process which addresses how we get a record in the ERP or the P2P, but it's not holistic across all of our different systems. And then lastly, the system tends to be a crutch which we hold on to, which I will elaborate in a little bit more detail in just a moment, but we center our life around a P2P or a SIM kind of system, or sorry, not a SIM, or an ERP type of system, which is not there to manage data, it's there to transact. And actually, you know, one of Kurt's slides showed that actually SIM doesn't belong in P2P because everything branches off of that, but yet majority of organizations are trying to force it into an ERP or a P2P suite. So lack of ownership, lack of governance, root cause around bad data. Now, why have and how have many organizations tried to solve it, and a little bit on why that hasn't worked. And I think Kurt also touched on some of these, but many see this as a big challenge, right? Lots of data, no one's touched it for a long time, and our experience is no one really wants to address it because it's going to be difficult. So with that and being overwhelmed by the big problem, then we look for quick wins. And these quick wins tend to be a single system. Hey, if we just buy a suite, then our data magically is going to be good. Reality is, I think everyone's kind of been there, multiple iterations of suites and ERP, and they still have bad data. It's not about the system. It's not a technology problem, as Kurt said. It's a business transformation problem. So don't try and solve it with a system. The second one, tightly related, we drive it around our ERP. Our ERPs are made to be efficient at transactions and processing and automating transactions. They were never built, and they're old systems 50, 60 years ago with a model in mind to deal with the landscape and what we're doing today with our suppliers and supply chain. The other area is we feel that, hey, we just need to cleanse our data, and that's going to solve it. And they see it as a one-off issue. Oh, we've got this bad data, let's take it out, let's clean it up. The problem everyone faces with that is, you know, let's say I'm going to extract my 50,000 records. I'm going to go and do all of this cleaning for a couple of months. The problem now is that in the meantime, what's happened to your data, all of it has changed in those few months. So it becomes a never-ending cycle. We can't load it back in. Cleansing like that doesn't work. Very weak, even though you need policy, and that we've seen more with public sector, is some think, hey, let's just define the policy and someone else is going to figure it out. Again, large organization, we see that less prominent in corporate environment, but that is a view. Some have looked to outsource it. Let's just ship it outside our four walls and they are going to fix it. Reality of these things, we've seen it with outsourcing. We ship with the intent to fix, but what happens is it's not getting fixed for the same reasons I mentioned before, is the people now dealing with it aren't the ones being impacted by poor quality data. They're doing an admin side of a front-end process. And then the last one, which is a very easy panacea, is, hey, let's send it out to a data provider, a DNB, a BVD. There's many of them out there. Again, the challenge you have here is no one is able to really use what goes because we're going to extract it. We'll send it to Dun & Bradstreet. Dun & Bradstreet maybe is going to change it and change our addresses and all of these things. Again, who's going to load all of that back into their ERP transactional, you know, GXP relevant system? The reality is no one can load that back in, right? You don't want the orders and the goods and the invoices to start failing. So they invest all this money to realize, oh, well, I can't really put it back into my operating systems. So it might be good if you want to analyze data, but if you want to drive operational excellence and drive quality at the operational level, data provider doesn't solve it for you. So these tend to be the route for most of us looking at the quick win. Now, if those don't work, what's another way of looking at it? And that's what I want to cover a little bit now. Recapping on the goal, and I think that's important. If we know that data quality is established at the time of creation, it is important that we have a single entry point, okay, for all data changes. Not to go into MDM theory, but for operational MDM, which is what you're doing here, not analytical, a single entry point transactional MDM is the most efficient and effective way. So the end goal we want is single place for any changes, upfront validations, all these things, and then of course beautifully synchronized into all of our other systems which want to consume the data. This is the end state, but it's a challenging end state to get to for most organizations. So we're going to go through the methodology. We're going to highlight obviously some of the key areas. We don't have time to dig into every single part. And reiterating a little bit of what Kurt said, it is not a IT project. It is a business transformation. I think that's the number one thing we have to keep in mind. And then it's not about the tech, but really about the governance. And if we start with that, then the tech and all these other things are going to fall into place very easily. So we look at 4 kind of core areas. Again, not going to go through all of this. I think seeing it as a business transformation, Kurt touched on these topics. We got to phase it. We have to have clear end state. We need executive sponsorship. We have to establish baselines. Then very important around the governance, to clearly identify who makes the decisions, who defines standards around all of these things, who owns the data, which part of the data, right? And even though you might have a centralized team, you will want lots of different data owners for different parts of the data. You'll need to define things like we call survivorship rules, which is, hey, we have duplicates. How do we know which record stays, which record goes? You want to define all these things at the beginning of a project. So when you go to execute, you're not having conversations with every single stakeholder. You've already got a governance board who's defining all these things, how we measure quality, etc. Then there is a process side of it, and eventually you need the right tech capability. So I'm going to just jump into detail on a few more of these, and happy afterwards we can have conversations on the full methodology. So what we see as super critical is starting with the right master data architecture. And it's a complex slide, but this is really trying to explain that you need to address all of your data stakeholders, is how we see them. And we see kind of 4 groups. And the way to interpret this slide, which I'm going to go through, is looking at it from right to left. So first stakeholder is the ERP or a system. And going back, as I said, that's the first mistake most make. That is not the central part of your strategy. The ERP system is a stakeholder. SAP needs data in a certain way. Oracle needs data in a certain way. Coupa needs data in a certain way. Viva needs, and so forth, right? So we need to understand we have many different systems, and they're just one other stakeholder. Then we've got an internal organizational view, and that is our local organization, the person in Germany, in Japan, in France, in the US. They want to see their part of the supplier. Which addresses do we use, right? What goods do we buy? They don't want to see everything, right? That would be inefficient for them. Then we have the supplier. The supplier is also a key stakeholder. If we want their experience to be simple and we want adoption from them, we can expose our internal complexity of, hey, you exist in all these systems and we've extended you to 50 different organizations and you have to do things, 50 different times, right? We have to make it really simple and streamlined for them to have that unique view. And then you have an analytical view of stakeholders, which is, we want to roll up suppliers into family trees. We want to see how IBM UK and US rolls up into IBM corporate, right? So a lot of different stakeholders. And the first mistake is, don't just look at your strategy from a ERP suite perspective, because that is the first mistake. You're never going to be able to address all the needs. And going into a little bit more detail, for those who are used to also an SAP world, SAP has a flat view of a supplier. In SAP, a record is an address. But the reality is that the supplier is not flat, and different systems represent a supplier in a different way. So success starts with having that right hierarchy and understanding that different business processes in different systems will happen at different levels, right? We might sign a contract with a supplier's legal entity because it's a legal document. That record might never ever exist in an ERP system, okay? We might then want an invoice and ordering location, and those tend to be what goes into an ERP system, right? We may have a manufacturing location. Many will be surprised. Oftentimes that isn't in an ERP system, but we might want it in a quality system. And then some may want to run processes like sustainability at a ultimate parent company level. So when you understand that this is the hierarchy and processes now are happening very differently to just transactions like 50 years ago, you need to see the importance of this hierarchy. There's different ways to do it, but we've seen best practice is above a legal entity and locations as addresses, we build what we call a headquarter, a global ultimate, and a customer-specific ultimate. Won't go in a huge amount of detail, but this approach then lets us play with a hybrid of using a data provider like a BVD or DNB and complementing it with the gaps which we know data providers have, either missing data or doesn't fully consolidate it in the way we want because the ownership might be different if you think of big consultancies like Deloitte or PwC. So hierarchy is important because we'll run processes efficiently, but also that is the secret of integration success. It's going to be very difficult to try and integrate stuff from an ERP system which doesn't have a complete record. And that's where all these workarounds and people are talking about the challenges of integration. You don't have the right hierarchy, and now it's very difficult to do all these integrations. If you start with the right hierarchy and don't think of SIM or MDM being part of P2P and transactional systems, this starts to become much easier because I'll send the invoice location to my transactional network, my invoice network, my Basswares and Tungstens. I'll send my ordering addresses to my Coupas and other systems, right? I'll send my manufacturing locations to my quality systems like Viva. I'll send my parent entity to something like EcoVadis so I can do sustainability in an efficient manner. So it's very nuanced, but integration success actually is also hugely linked to having the correct hierarchy. And if we have this well-defined hierarchy, then the beauty is later on, once we have this foundation and now we easily can connect our data silos, bringing in other capabilities like invoices, like transactions, like audits, all of these type of things becomes really easy because we know how to identify and supplier in all these systems. So you can really easily bring up these transactions and enable much better collaboration with your suppliers, which is the ultimate end game, right? But SIM is a must-have if you want to do efficient collaboration. Maybe a last area here to highlight when we think of data maintenance and data governance workflows, what we see is a lot of organizations tend to go overweight and focus on onboarding. And onboarding is super critical because it does deal with a lot of risk and compliance requirements. But the reality is you need to address all of the data governance processes. And many organizations ignore the fact that, hey, when I go live, I may be onboarding hundreds of suppliers a month or thousands a year, but the reality is I may have 50,000 or 100,000 existing suppliers, which we're going to want to extend, we're going to want to update, we're going to want to deactivate or reactivate. So you need processes done at the right level if you're also going to do it efficiently. And to give an example here, if we're adding a new invoice location and we already have an existing supplier, that onboarding should be really streamlined because we've already done a lot of these things. What we tend to see is because we follow, let's say, the ERP, where every supplier is the same as an address, companies re-onboard addresses of a supplier, redoing a lot of steps which they would never need to do. So that's where we come back to having the right level of granularity in your data governance workflows linked to the right hierarchy is ultimately what drives huge amount of efficiency and simplicity over time. So you want to make sure that you have these out of the box and you don't have to go and recreate them, because rather than just onboarding, there's actually 38 different data governance workflows which need to be done to correctly address this. So let me just recap, and then we'll leave some time for Q&A as well. Some of the key actions here is you need to remember it's a data transformation project. Sorry, it's a business transformation project, so it's not an IT. It's cultural change, it's cultural shift, mindset shift. We cannot leave data quality as an afterthought. It has to be first and foremost, and everyone has to take ownership. It's about governance and clear objectives, cleansing is not the panacea. It is an important element, but ultimately controlling the entry point is the number one thing you need to do, and cleansing as an afterthought will never be fully automated with a DNB or other data provider. Again, we can augment with this, but it is just one element, and we need to address the full governance aspect. And the other important thing is to just get started. I see a lot of organizations who are overwhelmed by the complexity, and we spend a lot of time thinking about it rather than just getting on with it. Also, another interesting fact is we're all now looking, how do we harness digital capabilities, AI, ML? Remember that 60 to 80% of your time on AI projects is spent around data cleansing. Okay, so it's important that you have this foundation to move forward in these areas as well. What are some of the value drivers? So ultimately what we see is it drives a common language within the organization. You tend to have people not aligned, not speaking the same languages. You will see a lot of productivity when done correctly, because today there's a lot of duplication. Integration challenges go away. Connected information starts with the right hierarchy and not centering around the ERP. We will be able to drive strong controls because we don't have human steps copying data around. One of the weakest areas of risk, by the way, is having people to re-enter and recopy data, by the way. That's a really weak business control. And ultimately, this foundation is the true value driver for digital and supplier collaboration. All right, with that, I'm gonna hand back over to Ant to see if there's any questions.
Yep, and I missed the button. There we go. Perfect. Thank you ever so much to excuse me, to both Kurt and to Kostas. I think it's evidently an incredibly important topic. It's an involved topic, and I'm delighted there's so many people on the call listening to how to approach it. So we've had a couple of questions submitted directly, and actually I've got one or two that came to me as we were going through it as well. So let's get cracking with those. If you still have any questions, then do feel free to put them into the chat, and we'll address those that we can. Okay, so first up, and I guess Kurt, since you've had a little rest, we'll start with you. For organizations that want to start measuring master data quality, where should they begin?
Yeah, it's a great question. Where do you begin? I highlighted the need to kind of measure data quality, the importance of doing it if you really want to drive improvement. What get measured gets improved is kind of the saying at Hackett. It starts with kind of identifying, not all master data is the same, right? So when we think about getting started from a data quality perspective and measuring the quality of our data, not all master data is the same. So what we typically are going to see is start from the question of what are we trying to do with the data, right? What are the decisions that the data drives? What are the core processes or the important processes that this data feeds and the decisions that come out of that? And then work your way backwards to identify what truly is a critical data element. So for example, at some of our clients, we've seen, we have data quality A, B, and C, right? A is the most important. We are going to establish certain levels of data quality for A-level master data, which is going to vary from, something that a piece of data maybe that doesn't drive as critical decisions in the organization, which might be assigned a level C, right? And then the quality targets that we have for that master data might be less on a C than an A, right? So we're starting to get into this criticality of data. Not all data is the same. Let's really emphasize data quality or highest levels of data quality on the most critical data versus data that, yes, it needs to be accurate, but inaccurate data isn't going to have as drastic an impact on the organization. So that's where we would suggest, kind of starting, understanding the data, prioritizing the data, assigning different levels of data control and data quality, setting targets, and then measuring, right? And measuring can be done, from a system perspective, but a lot of times it can, just the most basic way of doing it is just through audits. And the number of updates, managing where you have to go in and do updates to correct data might be a good way to measure that as well. But it starts with understanding the prioritization of your master data.
Okay, makes sense. So the idea that not a data. Sorry.
Definitely what Kurt says, but the other key thing people need to remember is you have to define standards and definitions, and that's maybe people forget that they're all about how do we measure data quality, but it's as simple as after you prioritize them, if you don't have standards, you can't measure. So ultimately, for those critical elements, then you need to define what is that standard, and actually then conformance to it is how we measure it, and it becomes quite simple once you've got this the standards defined.
Yeah, and that's a great point, right? We see all the time organizations go through this massive data cleansing process, right? They really focus on cleaning the data. But then they don't put in the policies, the definitions, the processes, the controls on an ongoing basis. So, 6 months, 12 months later, they're back in the same spot that they started.
Okay, great stuff. Thank you. This one's from me. So it occurred to me as you were presenting, Kurt. So some of the data points you raised earlier on, or was one of them was around inaccuracy of data submitted to the MDM team, and then a data input error made by the MDM team. And then a little bit later on, you raised this point, or you showed a data point saying that the top performing teams have a central MDM team. And I just wanted to explore that a tiny bit. Like, do we believe that organizations need a centralized MDM team? If so, where should that sit? Presumably IT, if they're the only organization that I guess has the kind of general purview. And is there an alternative way of thinking about it? And this is slightly cheeky because I know from conversations with Costas that we have a nuanced view of this. So maybe I'll throw it to you first, Costas. Do we think MDM is a central problem, or do we think there's a role for the business there in data quality?
Look, obviously it gets nuanced with definitions. So I think our experience is we don't want it to feel that it's IT owned. So it just depends where MDMs. I think having a central team, but I would argue it tends to be a light central team, and we want to have the owners to be cross-functional, right? The people who also use the data definitely should have some involvement throughout the process rather than one central team. But I do think you need an overarching central data stewardship team, right? So it can't go without. I don't think it's fully central. And I'd argue that all these teams, when we say one global team, I'm assuming there are divisional, regional, other teams which are supported. So I think you need both, but it's a light central team is what we've seen. And it's important that we don't make MDM team sound like this is an IT-owned project. That's where I would maybe emphasize that it is a business project. These are business processes, right? We talk about onboarding as creating master data, which I think is one of the differences from old school MDM to modern day SIM, right? Old school MDM was kind of IT led, and it was create, update, delete. No one was interested in that, but onboarding, right, and embedding it into all of these other risk and compliance elements is what is important to make it feel and act like a business process rather than just a data management process.
Yeah, makes sense. Kurt, do you agree?
Yeah, so absolutely. The reference to kind of a centralized master data management team. Look, as Costas pointed out, this process, the complexity of this process is very distributed, right? A lot of different hands in the cookie jar, touching the process, inputting data, providing input into data, using the data. It really does cut across a lot of processes, businesses, functions. The idea of a centralized master data team is, for example, if data needs to be, what you don't want is 30 different people having rights to go in and update, right? Ultimately, you want that somewhat controlled and some type of centralized organization. To Costas's point, that is trained on things like definitions, right? So they understand how to put the data in, the definitions under, what definitions kind of frame the data and how it should be inputted. The most obvious example is naming conventions for suppliers, for example. Having someone, within the business, sitting in the business, just isn't going to understand the naming conventions around suppliers. You want that done through a smaller group of people. So we are seeing at Hackett, not only with supply master data, but even customer data. In many cases, that is becoming kind of a centralized activity in terms of who inputs the data and makes updates to the data. And a lot of times it can sit in IT, but a lot of times it sits in a shared service GBS type of environment, GBS being a global business services type of organization.
Okay, sounds good. I've just been told I've got a bit of background noise on my mic, so apologies. I'll ask short questions. I think we've got time for one more. So, Kurt, I'm going to start with you on this one, if that's okay.
Yeah.
How can AI/ML help in maintaining supplier master data?
Yeah, and that's a interesting question, right? And with all the talk of AI, but to be honest, it's been around for a while with respect to kind of master data. We tend to the frontier tends to be around generative AI right now is kind of the next barrier here. But AI type of activities, and again, it's kind of to Costas's point, it's a definitional perspective. When you think about robotic process automation, we identify that as kind of an AI type solution at Hackett. And certainly it's been used for a while, right? I mean, something like an RPA solution. I'm going back probably 5 or 6 years when we had a very large automotive company come talk at one of our conferences, and they talked about a lot of the RPA, robotic process automation solutions they had implemented to help manage kind of master data, everything from kind of taking information that's submitted by stakeholders or suppliers and then automating the process of updating it to maintaining things like supplier pricing updates, as an example. Certainly you want someone in there to control and approve that. But it can become a very manual process. And a lot of times it is very rule-based. So managing master data, the good thing about it is to Costas's point, if you put the definitions in place, if you put the rules in place, that does then translate very well into something like an RPA or machine learning type of solution in terms of ongoing management, updating of that information.
I would just add one quick point to that, which is in our experience, it is a little bit like a panacea. So it can support it, but it depends firstly on your use case. So if you think what we typically do, which is what I said, operational MDM, which is going into your core financial transactional systems, the problem there with AI and ML is you need highly accurate data. The payment cannot go out to the wrong place, or the invoice or the goods. So whilst it can augment, is what we're seeing and doing within processes, you still need, unless you have a good reference source, you still need an element of governance and controls, right? If you're just doing analytics, spend analysis, those sorts of things, then it can play a bigger role because, hey, if something is a little bit off, it's not going to affect any of your core financial or supply chain processes, right? So whilst we use it on its own, it cannot solve the world.
Excellent. All right. Well, that's a good note to finish on. So we are right on the hour. So it remains to say thank you ever so much, Kurt. Really appreciate you joining us. Great insight as ever. And Costas as well. Really useful information. Thanks for everyone who attended. As I said at the start, the session's being recorded. So we will share information afterwards and look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you very much indeed, and goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks.